welcome back to my channel, Git Cozy, or welcome if you're new here. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing this very special pen here. This is a Pelikan M1000 from the 2003 to 2010 era. And as you can tell from the title, this Pelikan M1000 is very special in that it has a triple broad nib. Let's just take a moment to appreciate this big nib. You can see the 3B stamped at the base, and look at the tip of that nib. You see that? Lots of tipping material there. So this nib is ginormous, and you can see that the line width that you get from this pen is very bold. A lot of ink comes out of this pen because it is an M1000. And when I think about all of the reasons why I use fountain pens, typically it's for note-taking, journaling, or using in my planner, which is a Hobonichi Weeks and requires some very tiny writing. This pen is practically impractical for all of the use cases that I would normally use for a fountain pen. And what's very appalling is the nib alone is worth over $1,000. So today I want to talk about why this pen even exists, who is this pen for, why is this nib and pen so expensive, and why do I have this pen in the first place? So in today's video, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on broad nibs in general, the M1000 having a triple broad nib. I'll tell you why I have this pen, what we paid for it, and then I'm also going to be doing some writing samples on camera. I have a variety of nib sizes that I want to compare this one to. So we'll get into all of that. I'll also talk about how this pen gets used in my household and what my final thoughts are. So let me scoot you in closer, and then we will talk about why this pen exists in the first place. All right, so let me take you back to the 1820s. The 1820s is when people were still widely using hand-cut quill pens. And back in those days, if you had a lot of writing volume that you had to get done or write very quickly, you would go through quill pens very quickly as well. You'd have to keep cutting the quill because it would dull, you need to keep it sharp, and eventually you'd get through the whole quill altogether and then you had to get a new one. So it was just wildly impractical. So eventually in the 1820s, we have the mass production of steel nibs. And they were really produced in one of two main groups. The first was a broad group of nibs, which were very stiff with a very wide point. And then the second group is called pointed. So these were nibs that were very flexible. Originally, broad nib pens were workhorse tools. Steel stubbed nibs were built as a reaction against really scratchy, pointy nibs like a quill, so that professionals could write large amounts of writing really quickly without having to baby the pen. So you may have heard of something called the judge's quill or the probate pen. These were pens that were marketed for professionals that needed to churn out a lot of volume of writing. And so even back in those days, Esterbrook was one of those companies that would mass produce these types of pens that were marketed to these types of professionals. And those pens had nibs that had broader, wider tips so that they could churn out large amounts of writing very quickly. At the time, the familiar letter system that we're used to today, which is the extra fine, medium, broad, double broad, and triple broad stamps that we see on the nibs, this really was a 20th century industry standard. Prior to this, it really was mostly dependent on the manufacturer, and so the standardization didn't really become popular until later on. Now, why would somebody want to purchase a really broad nib? What is a use case? So back in the early to mid 20th century, larger handwriting was actually a bit more normal. Formal cursive was typically used, and writing that in a larger handwriting size was pretty standard. But when it came to professionals needing broad nibs specifically, it varied for a variety of different use cases. For instance, executives, bank managers, doctors, notaries, anyone whose signature served a functional purpose as part of like a legal profession or a mark of authority had a real incentive to make their signature bold and unmistakable. And that's for a few different reasons. One, it was just to make sure that their signature was easily visible. But the second was with really big, bold signatures and like a big bold line, it's actually harder to forge signatures. So it was very practical from that standpoint. And then for other professionals who had to just churn out a large volume of writing very quickly, professions like being an author, a journalist, a lawyer, having a broader nib was easier to write very quickly because you weren't really fussing with a small scratchy nib where you have to baby and be very precious with. So you can imagine somebody who's signing dozens of signatures every day or writing out paragraph after paragraph of text would want a pen that's very smooth, very inky, and also just puts out a larger line because it was just easier to write fast. So in 1929, Pelikan's own nib unit system started with their first fountain pen, and these pens had nibs that were threaded and swappable. So I don't have the original style that came out, but I do have a vintage Pelikan 140. This is a pen that came out sometime after 1952, but the idea would be that stationers and stationery stores who sold stationery products would carry a single pen body and multiple nib sizes, and the nibs were threaded so that you could swap out nib sizes for the same pen body, and that would give consumers various options for their writing. So back then, you wouldn't necessarily associate like a big fancy triple broad nib with a big pen. All of the pen bodies would look the same, just with different nib sizes. Now, who was actually buying those larger nib sizes? So any of those who were in a profession that I already mentioned, such as lawyers, doctors, judges, notaries, someone whose signature had some kind of authoritative legal association with it. And some consumers may have not had any of those professions and just really had a preference for larger, bigger, bolder lines. Maybe their natural handwriting was just really big. Maybe they had poor fine motor skills, and so it was really difficult to write very small and precisely. Back then, people were not necessarily thinking about ink sheening and shading. It was more of just the practicality of getting your words down on paper effectively and efficiently. Okay, so let's fast forward to 1997 when the Pelikan M1000 came to the market. So in the 90s, big fountain pens were being marketed as being associated with luxury, prestige, and a status symbol. So we see this with the marketing from Montblanc and their 149 pen. That pen was really big and seen as a status symbol. So bigger meant more prestige. And so Pelikan came out with their M1000 pen to compete with the Montblanc 149, and this was their version of their big flagship pen, along with a big pen to be associated with prestige and status. Why not also have a big wide nib that produces a big wide line for really bold signatures that were unmistakable? A big pen with a big nib was really just the epitome of power, status, and authority. So this is really different from the 1950s, where a big bold line was just very practical. And then the late 90s is this era where we have this switch up to having this actually being associated with a luxury status symbol, something that an executive professional like a CEO would own specifically because it's oversized, an authoritative symbol on paper. Their signature pops, it's hard to forge, and it was seen as big and imposing. It maximizes a statement to leave an impression. And so, of all of the nib sizes that you could get for the largest pen from Pelikan, this was the widest, the boldest, and the most expressive. So it was aimed at those wanting to make a statement. There is one other consumer I haven't mentioned yet that was known at the time for being interested in really broad nibs, and that is a nibmeister, someone who creates custom grinds on fountain pens. The more metal that you have on the tip of your fountain pen nib means more options for customizations. So you're probably familiar with these, but if you want to get a custom ground for an oblique nib, a cursive italic, architect journaling nib, having more tipping material made that easier. So that is why this pen exists and who it was intended for. And it's just very interesting to me that it originally came to market because it was very practical, which makes a lot of sense, but the way that people write nowadays is typically finer. We're trying to fit as many words in a single page as we can, and a lot of people are doing electronic signatures these days and don't necessarily need a very big, bold line to make a signature. Okay, so now I've told you that this pen is really associated with prestige and luxury and authority. Why do I have this pen? I don't have prestige, authority, or any reason to have this pen. So I'm actually borrowing this from my husband, who's also not an executive authority figure either. We have this pen because we are enthusiasts. And so I think nowadays a pen like this is more associated with other people like us who really enjoy playing with fountain pens, playing with inks. And so the consumer who is seeking out these types of pens has changed yet again to be those who really just want to play with this for fun. Now, being a pen that's just for fun and wildly impractical, it is wildly expensive and a little bit appalling. So I will tell you how much we paid for this pen. We got this pen for $405 after shipping and fees and everything like that. That's the cost that it came out to be. And the nib alone has been sold for over $1,000. So while this was wildly expensive and it's wildly impractical, I would say that it is objectively a good price for what it's worth. So why is this worth so much money? It's due to scarcity and rarity. This type of nib has been discontinued from Pelikan, specifically for the M1000. So originally, you could get the M1000, also the M800, with oblique nibs and also the double broad and triple broad. Back in 2012, Pelikan actually discontinued all oblique nibs, and then the next year, in 2013, the double broad and triple broads were also discontinued, and they cited that this was due to low global sales. So since 2013, for the M1000, the only offerings that they had were extra fine, fine, medium, and broad. So because the triple broad M1000 has been discontinued, the scarcity and rarity has just really driven up the price. So the last time it was produced was around 2013. It's been 13 years since then, and as time goes on, it's going to be harder and harder to find these pens. And so now, this pen is worth well over $1,000. All right, so now that I've told you a little bit of background on this pen, why it exists, who's it really for, I want to do some writing samples and compare the nib width of this pen versus some others that I have. So let me zoom you in and we'll do some writing samples. Okay, so we're gonna do some writing samples on this paper called CRENA paper. I really like it. I talked about this in my video where I explained my new ink log swatching system, and I ended up using this paper for that. It reminds me a lot of Tomoe River paper because it does show sheeting and shading so nicely. It's very thin. Anyway, let's do some writing samples. I'm using Pelikan 4001 Royal Blue. I just felt like that was really fitting. So I'm going to be doing 6 writing samples from thinnest to thickest. I just really want you to see how broad the line width on this pen is, and I just think that seeing it compared to other nib sizes on the same page does it a lot of justice. So let's start with an extra fine nib. This is with my Pelikan M1000. This is such a beautiful, beautiful nib. I think this is my favorite nib, probably of all time. I really love it. It is pretty juicy and thick for an extra fine, but I do think that that just makes the writing experience that much more fun. And I don't know, this is just one of my most fun pens to journal with. As far as tiny writing goes, it's okay. I can definitely do some tiny writing. Of all the pens I'm going to show you today, this one definitely does tiny writing the best. I do find myself using this in my Hobonichi weeks from time to time. I think the only hard part is it just puts out so much ink. So it takes a little bit of time for ink to dry. Now my husband has another Pelikan M1000. This is actually with a fine nib, so a little bit broader than my extra fine. And I would also say it is a bit wetter than the extra fine. Hopefully you can see the ink pooling on the paper, but it's a little bit broader than the extra fine. I don't really think that this is suitable for my Hobonichi weeks just because of that reason. I can do some tiny writing, but it's definitely a guzzler. But again, still super bouncy, super fun, really shows some ink properties really nicely. And then we're gonna skip medium because I don't have a medium Pelikan to show you. I do have a broad, so this is with a modern Pelikan M120. This pen was created to celebrate the vintage style, and it came out in 2019. I got it on eBay for about $120, and I do have a broad size nib on here. Now, This pen is actually a gold-plated steel nib, but I think of all of my other pens, the flex on this nib is the most reminiscent to the M1000s, in my opinion, which I just kind of find funny because of the lower price point of this pen in comparison. Um, it's not as bouncy or springy, but definitely has a lot of bounce for a steel nib. It is broad, but it's honestly not that much broader from the Pelikan M1000 with the fine nib, as you can see. It probably even puts out less ink. This is usually a pen that shows off every single ink really, really nicely. I don't think I've ever put an ink in here that doesn't look good. And the next one is really fun too. So this is a true vintage Pelikan 140. This is my husband's. This pen originally came with a fine nib, but we ended up seeing this double broad nib unit on eBay. Because you were able to swap out the nibs, we ended up purchasing this one, putting it on this pen, and it just makes it so much fun to write with. And as you can see, the tipping material is a little bit flatter, more stub-like, and I think that just makes it really, really fun to write with. So this is a Pelikan 140, the double broad, and yeah, this is such a lovely nib. I really recommend some of these like vintage Pelikan nibs. I have an oblique fine on my 140, and it is just one of the most fun nibs to write with in my opinion. Now you can see the line thickness does jump up from the broad to the extra broad quite a bit. I would say more so from the fine to the broad. Now, obviously, these aren't all the same pens, so it might look different in an M1000 broad nib pen, but I don't have that to show you today. But you can definitely see that the line thickness is starting to jump up quite a bit. All right, now the moment we've all been waiting for, the triple broad Pelikan. All right, so this is the triple broad nib. Look at that thing. It is so, so big. Let me show you compared to the fine. Look at the difference. So the triple broad is on top, the fine is on the bottom. Isn't that insane? Here's how they look on the underside. So you can just definitely see how much broader and wider that triple broad nib is. Now let's compare it to the double broad. Obviously, the nib itself on the M1000 is going to be bigger, but the double broad is quite wide. And you can see that both of them have a little bit of like a stubbiness to them. And then this is how the undersides look. So definitely the double broad is wide, but the triple broad is just quite a bit wider. All right, so let's do a writing sample with this big bad boy. So this is a Pelikan M1000. I know a lot of people do like a 3B. I just think it's fun to write three 3Bs literally. And yeah, this thing is just a monster of a pen. It really does feel like I'm writing with a marker. And as you can see, it does have some really nice line variation. Not quite as much as the vintage 140. That one is super stubby, but if I do any kind of tiny writing, I mean, it's virtually illegible. So really, this is best for larger types of writing. And then I want to do one more writing sample. This is with an Aspine C80, so it's not a Pelikan, but it does have a stub nib. It is a 1.1 stub. You can get this on Amazon for under $30. I will link it down below. So if you really like stub nibs and like thicker, bolder lines, but you don't want to pay, $100 or $1,000, this is something that can still get you those big, bold lines. It's kind of fun in and of itself. So this is an Aspine C80 with a stub 1.1 nib. And certainly it is not as bold as the triple broad or the double broad, but it comes kind of close to the double broad and the broad. Definitely able to do some tiny writing, but that is how that one looks. And then in case you're curious, this is how the Aspine nib compares to the Pelikan triple broad. The actual nib size itself is even a little bit wider than the triple broad, and it's a little bit longer, so it's a huge nib. But as you can see, it does have that stubbiness to it. And then this is how the tipping material looks. So obviously not as big, broad, and wide as the Pelikan, but still really fun to play with if this is something that you are interested in on a budget. All right, so here's how all of the writing samples look side by side. I would say that the biggest jump here is from the broad to the double broad, and then obviously the double broad to the triple broad is another really big jump. The 120 and the 140, they're not in 1000, so it's not truly a direct comparison. I do think that some of these pens put out more ink than others based on the pen body itself, but at least we can get some kind of idea for how the line width changes with the different nib sizes. Okay, so what I want to do next is just do some close-up writing samples without me talking so we can just really appreciate how these different pens work with this ink. And then after that, I will tell you what we use this pen for in my household and what my final verdict is on who this is really for in today's day and age and whether or not it's really worth its value. Okay, so there you have the writing samples. And so let's just take a closer look. I mean, even just looking from further away, the double broad and the triple broad really do make this ink look very, very nice and saturated. And then when it comes to the writing samples themselves, the sheening and shading is most apparent on the double broad and triple broad nibs. So, I mean, look at that. You see that purple coppery sheen and all of that shading from very light to very dark. It's just a very beautiful range of a watercolor effect. And then this is what a swatch with a dip pen looks like. And you can see that for the M1000 with the triple broad nib, it is most like the ink swatch and maybe even shows off the shading even more. So really nice. And then, this ink is pretty dry and well behaved just generally, but this paper does handle it really well. I mean, there is some ghosting, but it's minimal and there's like no bleed through at all. So when it comes to trying to figure out what this pen is good for. I think this showcases that it's really good for playing with your inks and showing off their potentials. You can definitely see the sheening and shading properties, and this is an ink that I don't particularly love in a lot of my pens, but I do love it with this pen. I do find that it's also a good way to just use an ink that maybe you would be neglecting otherwise. So one potential use case is just for hobbyists, enthusiasts like my husband and I to just sit around and play with inks and appreciate their potentials of sheening and shading with a pen like this. Another use case that I've had for this pen is for headers in my journal. In my journal, I typically have a header for the date, and I like it to be thicker and bolder. So, any kind of writing where you need a thick and bold line is where I think a pen like this could be useful. So, no, it's not like I'm using it for very long, but it does help me to denote the next section of my journal. And my journal is a place where I really do like to play with my fountain pens. So, I find it to be really good for that. Here is another entry where I use this pen as like a header. This is with Jayarbon Cacao do Brazil, which is another dry ink that I find to work really well in this pen. And then I used it again on a different journal entry. Now, would I recommend buying a pen this expensive just to write a header in a journal? No, but I already have it, so I kind of might as well. So seems a little bit obscene, but is a use case that I have found at least functionally for some kind of day-to-day use. And then the third use case I think about where we like to have a bold line is the occasional birthday or holiday card that we send a family. We've used this pen for that, and it just adds a little bit of a flair. It's fun, adds some character, so that's another use case. So, I mean, the primary use cases that we've had for this pen have been to play with our inks, write a header in my journal because I need a bold line, and also to sign off on a birthday or holiday card to a family member. Do I think it's worth shelling out hundreds of dollars for this pen just for those things alone? No, I don't. Let me tell you this though. As somebody who's a hobbyist, an enthusiast, and a collector at this point, this is a nib unlike anything else I've ever tried. It is so incredibly unique. It has that bounce and spring and beauty of an M1000 nib, and the triple broad size really does just make it feel that much more special. So it is a bit of a novelty in that respect, but I don't think it's worth shelling out $1,000 to get something like this. It's obnoxiously expensive, wildly impractical, but it is fun, and I really love that. To me, fountain pens are not so serious. I really like to have them to have fun with them, appreciate them, romanticize my life, and I definitely think this adds value in that way. I want to hate it because it's so obnoxiously expensive and impractical, but I don't hate it. I do think that it adds joy to our lives, and the fact that I get to share it with somebody justifies it that much more. I don't know. So I would say that this is for somebody who's an enthusiast like my husband and I, a collector, or maybe you are an executive and you have a prestigious status and you want a big, bold signature with a big, bold pen. This would be for you. So that is my final verdict. That is my thoughts on the Pelikan M1000 with a triple broad nib. I would love to know, have you ever played with an M1000 nib? Have you played with a triple broad one? Would you consider seeking one out? Do you think that the price is appalling since it's wildly impractical? Tell me your thoughts and opinions. I would love to read them down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you liked it, I would really appreciate a thumbs up or subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye!